Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights podcast, where we bring you ideas, experiences, and best practices from the real estate development industry. My name is Payam Noor Salehi, and I'm your host here. My guests for this episode, in this episode, I have two guests, and they're both planners. They work for a company called the Big Leary Group, which is a planning firm. They have experience in a variety of projects and variety of planning situations, going from for site plan approvals, condominiums, subdivisions, official plan amendments, zoning bylaw amendments, you name it. They've done it. They've been working on it for many years. And I've had the good fortune of working with Michael Testaguzza, one of the planners and one of the guests for this episode, on a couple of projects in the past few years. And our other guest today is Robert McKillen, who also is a planner and works for the Big Leary Group. In this episode, we want to dig deep into some of the very positive changes that have been happening in the city of Toronto and over the past year or so that have potentially created or are going to create significant opportunities for development and intensification inside the city of Toronto. Mainly, they are known under the overall initiatives on improving housing options in neighborhoods. And we particularly are going to focus on the multiplexes and the major streets in this episode. What is the definition of a multiplex as it pertains to the new regulation? Or how do you qualify for the benefits of this new regulation, which includes incentives with regards to the development charges and other items? What is the definition of major streets? How can you find more information about these major streets? How can you make sure your project or your potential future project gets the most out of these initiatives? What items to flag and what obstacles to avoid as much as possible to speed up your application process? And what opportunities these initiatives bring for real estate developers in the city of Toronto, and particularly if you already own a piece of land or parcel of land that is one of these streets, or even you have been flipping houses and you've been building custom houses, and now there's a whole new avenue of opportunities in front of you. That being said, both of our guests emphasize the fact that we're on a learning curve. We're at the beginning stages of a learning curve where everyone, including the city, the neighborhoods, ourselves, the planners, the consultants, are all learning about what does this regulation actually mean, how does it look like when it hits the ground, and all the fun stuff that goes with that. And as always, you can find more information about the episode and about our guests on our website, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. That's all one phrase. And I hope you enjoy listening to this podcast episode. If you like the show, please remember to subscribe, and that would really help us. And also make sure to come back and check for new episodes every couple of weeks. Thank you very much. Enjoy listening. Hey guys, thank you for joining the show. We have Michael and Robert here with us. This is my first experience having two guests in one podcast episode. For the audience, please bear with us. It's going to be fun. We're going to play it out and we'll see how it goes. We've had some challenges so far getting it work from a technical perspective, but it's going to be good. Good to have you guys on board. Why don't we go ahead and have you guys introduce yourselves? Michael, we will start with you.
For sure. Well done for remembering to call out one of us. It's going to be important as we move forward. So
yeah,
thank you for that. Yeah, my name is Michael Testaguzza. I'm a partner at the Big Leary Group. We're private land use planning consultants, work GTA wide. We work in a variety of kind of fields, residential, commercial, employment, everything from minor variances all the way up to site plans and everything in between. Because of that, we get our fair share of, and we're getting a lot of traction on various EHON initiatives as they work their way from high level thoughts to policies to now hitting developers' desks and hitting thereafter our desks for implementation. And so what we get to see is all of the ideas that then translate into policy, how those actually end up being implemented from a planning perspective. So it's really interesting. But a little bit about me. I did my master's in planning from TMU. Was in 2014 I graduated. Before that, I was at U of T. I did a specialist in urban studies and a major in poli-sci. So I kind of always knew I wanted to go into planning, which is kind of weird. Yeah, I followed a 6-year plan out of high school. Very odd.
So it does happen, actually. So it actually does happen. You're one of the few.
I might be one of the few. Yeah, I knew going into university that's what I wanted to do, and I didn't get dissuaded somehow. Maybe I'm stubborn.
Good.
I don't know.
Keep going. Keep going. Please keep going.
I worked 3 years in private practice coming out of school. While I was in school, I actually worked with Gagnon and Law. Now it's Gagnon Walker Domes, which is a private firm. I worked for the city of Toronto and the city of Brampton a bit as a student, and then worked 3 years with Humphreys Planning in Vaughan, another small private planning firm, and then off to the Big Leary Group, which is where I'm at now. Started as an intermediate in 2018, and now I'm a partner in 2024. Been a bit of a whirlwind. It's me in a nutshell.
Pretty good. That's pretty good. I think you and I first started working probably 2018. That was probably one of our first encounters. Yeah, time flies. Thank you very much.
That was one of my first projects.
Oh, was it? Okay, good. That was a good project. Robert, to you.
Okay, my turn. My name is Robert McQuillan, or you can call me Robbie. Robert's so formal.
Okay.
I also, like Michael, have a Master of Planning degree from Toronto Metropolitan University, TMU. And I've been with the Big Leary Group now for about a year and a half as an urban planner. Prior to going into planning, I did my undergrad in commerce at McMaster, and then I worked in change management in the financial services industry for a few years. So it's been a bit more of a winding path for me to get to planning, but really, I've always cared about cities. I've always been interested in how people live in cities, how we experience the places that we call home. And I've had a passion for making these places better, which is kind of how I ended up in planning and why I've ended up here. And I'm excited to talk about how we're expanding housing options in neighborhoods, making our city better for the next generation and things of that nature. So I get to work on that on the ground here at the Big Leary Group. We have, like Michael said, a variety of different projects in different, I guess, fields of land use planning. So commercial, industrial, residential, everything from urban infill to broader master plans in places further afield. I get to see a lot, get to work on a lot, and get to learn a lot on the regular. So happy to share some of those learnings today.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I'm going to come back to the range that you just described from infill to land use and broad land planning. And I'm going to come back to that. But just before doing that, so you mentioned change management. So part of our discussion, hopefully, and part of what we want to see more of is going to be change management in terms of changing the policies, changing the planning, changing the regulation to allow changing outcomes, right? Because we were talking with a friend recently, and basically the same definition came up. That definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. And we've been doing so many things over and over and over and again in City of Toronto and GTA and probably for the most part of the country. And if we expect a different result, then there goes the definition. So with that being said, I want to focus mostly in this episode around the recent changes that have been happening and pick your brain, both of you guys, about some of the major changes and what does a developer need to know in terms of the changes that happened, are going to happen, or you foresee that they come down. Maybe we start with you, Michael.
Yeah, for sure. Certainly. So I think one of the things we want to talk about today, and I think it's going to branch off into two different subject matters that are pretty specific, is the City of Toronto's expanding housing options in neighborhoods project. And that's an initiative that involves many different pilot projects and different ideas that they're priority projects that they're running through. But in essence, the thought behind it was that anywhere between 30 to 40% of the city's land mass is actually taken up by neighborhoods, just depending on how you define a neighborhood and which way you look at it. But it's a large portion of the city. And the policies in those portions of the city traditionally haven't really favored intensification or development. The idea of expanding housing options in neighborhoods is something the city's been working on since 2019. And particularly two of the initiatives that have got off the ground and are at various advanced, I would say, stages of kind of implementation on a policy basis are actually the Multiplex initiative and the Major Street initiatives. And maybe I'll lead us into the multiplexes a bit, and I'll let Robbie talk a little bit about the major streets. Because I think it's important first to explain, what does that mean? What is a multiplex? What does major streets mean? Because that's even more vague.
True.
Yeah, exactly. So a multiplex it's intended and it can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different places. So we'll say what it means in the city of Toronto and for the purposes of what the city's doing. In essence, it is 4 units, up to 4 units being permitted in either a duplex, triplex, or fourplex built form. And what that means is you get 4 doors on any individual lot. However, it's not as simple as that because you could think of a townhouse having 4 doors. The basic thing that the city of Toronto has said for it to be a multiplex is there needs to be a degree of stacking. So portion of a unit needing to be on top of another portion. And it's that simple actually in the city. That's how you become a fourplex, a triplex, a duplex. A degree of stacking and the number of doors. And in essence, at a very high level, the way the city set it up is that if you are building a building that you would otherwise be allowed to build, so a single detached, let's call it. If you could put a single detached on this lot, certain front yards, certain backyards, certain side yards, certain height, whatever it is, that built form massing, you can now have 4 doors. You can have 4 units. That's in essence, in the simplest way, what the city has opened up, both from an official plan perspective and from a zoning perspective. There's a couple other important things to know about that. There's no development charges. If you're doing 4 or less units, that's obviously key for developers.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big change. And it's, we've told people that and it's come up as a surprise and really got people, I think, more interested in the idea. There's also no cash in lieu. And they do have certain additional permissions. They're very small. Like you're allowed to do 3 stories in locations where otherwise you'd only be allowed to do 2. But you're still subject to a 10-meter height limit. So you get those 3-story products where you see the 3rd story kind of hidden in a dormer as an expression of this a lot of the time. That's multiplexes in a nutshell. The only other thing
let me just recap just to make sure I got it right. So basically, the way the city is streamlining it, at least from my perspective, is saying, I don't want to have to talk to you about what you could have built here. Basically, if you could have built a single-family dwelling, which was a detached house, still the same criteria applies. You don't need to re-educate everyone on what that means, right? So you take that, and in this particular case, go and try and figure out how you put 4 units. Maybe walk us through the stacking logic. I'm not 100% sure I'm getting the stacking. Is the idea that the city wants to make sure you never go later and ask for severance and say, I want to build this, sell these separately? Is that kind of they're trying to mitigate?
So you can sell them separately. You can condominiumize multiplexes. There's actually no prohibition against that. So, and that's actually where we've seen most of the traction in this has actually been in developers looking to condominiumize the 4 units and sell them rather than have that rental. That's just, and again, it's early days. We don't know where it's going to go and if that's going to be the primary, but that's what we've experienced on our end. The idea of stacking is really more of, it's the way they've defined multiplex. So multiplex is defined, a key element of it, separating it from a semi-detached or a townhouse, is the fact that the units are stacked on top of each other. Gotcha. It's really the operable part of the definition in the zoning bylaw, which you're getting really nitty gritty into. But that's the difference between a townhouse, a fourplex, or a duplex, or a triplex.
So maybe walk us through. So that's multiplexes. What the definition of the multiplex, right? So what next?
Thinking back to that expanding housing options in neighborhoods umbrella, the multiplexes were one project that fell into this EHON category. The major streets is the next thing in line. So basically what the city did is it took a look at all of the streets that it considers to be major streets in its official plan, and has said that if you are a property on one of those major streets, and you're in what the city calls a neighborhood, and that land is zoned residential, you can now build, as of right, an apartment building up to 6 stories in height and with up to 60 units, or you can build townhouses. So the zoning provisions and the official plan policies previously would have been significantly more restrictive in what you could build on those properties. But now the city's saying, hey, we have all of these major streets with great frontages, with great accessibility. We should make it easier for builders to add more density to these properties so that we can accommodate more residents in places that are walkable, serviced by transit, serviced by existing services, and things of that nature. So that's really the high level of what Major Streets is talking about. At this point, the multiplexes have undergone their official plan amendment. They've undergone their zoning bylaw amendment. They're in action and we're building them.
Perfect.
Major Streets were approved by council back in the late spring of this year, 2024. However, they've been appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal. So right now, the appeal process is ongoing. And essentially, what that's looking like is the party that made the appeal believed that some of the policies related to the major streets typology were actually too restrictive. So they want a bit more flexibility in things like building performance standards, like setbacks and building depth and articulation facing the public right of way. So they're really seeking to liberalize some of those policies that the city has put forward. On one hand, that could certainly result in perhaps, like I said, a more liberal policy that could be applied in different ways in different contexts. They're saying that they don't want a one-size-fits-all across the city. Right. They want a bit more flexibility. On the other hand, it creates this process where there's lots of property owners and builders that are ready to go and bring this major streets product to market, whether it's the apartment building or the townhouses, that are now sitting on the sidelines waiting to see what happens with that appeal and when it goes.
Yeah. And I want to take a minute as well just to go through the definition of the townhouses in this particular case and how that differs from the 60-unit setup. But just for my understanding, so if hypothetically, if and when this passes and becomes an action, like becomes reality, do we still need to follow the mid-rise guidelines that we've had to deal with the angular plane, or is that entirely gone?
So this policy really strips away some of those regulations that made these mid-rises a little bit more restrictive in the past. So the major streets policies is taking a form-based approach. You must follow the setbacks in the zoning bylaw and the height limits, but there are no angular planes that will be applied.
The only thing I was also going to add to that is when you talk about angular planes, we're really talking about the mid-rise guidelines, right? The City of Toronto's mid-rise guidelines. And I just want to point out, because there's an essential distinction here, and I don't want people getting a little bit confused about this. The mid-rise guidelines were intended to apply to properties that were mixed-use designation in avenues in the City of Toronto. So it's actually a very different geography that we're talking about.
Wouldn't the avenues and the major streets have major overlaps?
They would have overlaps in some cases. However, when we're talking about major streets, they have to have three main criteria. One, they have to be a major street in the official plan. Two, they have to be neighborhoods in the official plan. And three, they have to be zoned residential. When we're talking about avenues, those properties that would be subject to the avenues and mid-rise guidelines might be on major streets, but they're likely zoned for mixed use or apartment neighborhoods, which distinguishes them from the properties that we're talking about when we're talking major streets.
And just to be clear, you guys are talking very technical terms, which have very proper definitions, I'm sure. And I'm coming from a layman's perspective to it, and I need to bring it down to earth. And basically, so what I'm gathering is that if you have a property, if you're a landowner or a developer that previous to this could have used the avenues and the mid-rise guidelines would have been applicable to your site, it doesn't really change that much on your front. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. What this has done, the avenues in the City of Toronto were a very specific subset of major streets. It only applied to, maybe like a Shepherd, a Finch, but it wouldn't have applied maybe to pieces of Dufferin,
right?
For example. So what they've done is really broadened this out. Avenues were a very specific subset. They didn't apply to many major streets in the city. Whereas this major street policy, once it comes into effect in its fullness, will, I don't have a number, but I would say more than double, probably triple, probably even more than that.
The properties. But sorry, I want to make this clear because, and I apologize for emphasizing this because I've seen many properties that when we run the numbers from the pro forma on a small development site, and you would fall under the avenues, and you have to go with the angular plane, and you have to go with the turning radiuses and everything else that comes with that. It just does not work with the pro forma. You cannot make the numbers work. What I'm trying to figure out, and maybe we don't know is the best answer right now, maybe we have to wait and figure out, is that will these changes free up some of those regulations that were previously cost prohibitive, or is it just opening up a new set of opportunities that may or may not be overlapping with the previous law?
So I get the point. There will not be angular planes regards to anything on major streets. That's not going to be kind of an applicable framework to review. There still is going to be the requirement for loading and type G loading spaces if you're over 30 units. And I think that's the other thing you were getting at, right? The ability to basically turn a truck around in your site because that takes up a lot of space at grade. And how do you make that work? And I think that's going to be interesting to see as we talk about assemblies, because major streets allows you to go up to 60 units and 6 stories. Right. And if you need to get a type G loading space, so the ability to have a waste collection vehicle enter your site in a forward motion and leave your site in a forward motion as well, is there going to be a zone, the Venn diagram, or those 2 circles going to converge where you can make that work with a 6-story building and 60 units and the size of property you have on in the city of Toronto on major streets? I don't know the answer to that.
You and I are very much traveling in the same direction. That's where I was going with this, because going back to what Robbie was saying earlier, I'm happy that someone is trying, and I don't know the specifics of it, but someone is pushing to liberalize it. I think I said it right there. But basically, between single staircases or double staircases, as it is right now, type G and turning radius for the garbage collection, the angular plane, the setbacks, and a whole bunch of other things that I'm sure you guys have dealt with, it's really hard to make a site work on even these sites. Like the first time I heard about the 60 unit and 6 stories, I'm like, yay, very exciting. But then you sit down, look at the size of the most common sizes that are parcels of land that we have in these avenues or these neighborhoods. And to your point, if you wanted to call it the Venn diagram, you're like, okay, you know what? Good. Thank you. Maybe it really helps. And listen, these are all steps in the right direction. And you took away the parking requirement, which is great. And you add all these up. Now we're breathing. You can breathe. We were choking before. We can breathe right now, but it's still distance from running. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, we know that, development in the GTHA, it's full of rules, and they're rules for good reasons. We're not going to say that there's rules for bad reasons, necessarily, but, this is only one small kind of subset of all the different changes that, maybe need to happen to kind of give this its full expression. That's why I said, we're kind of on the ground between the thoughts, then the implementing documents come. And then it hits the ground and it's implementation. And that's where you find out, is this enough, or are there other tweaks that need to be made in the fullness of time to kind of get it off the ground?
If I'm a developer and if I need to think about these things and I need to make some decisions, what are some mental models, frameworks, or steps or strategies that I need to have in mind to be able to benefit or at least utilize to the best of my abilities some of these changes?
Okay, this is a really good question. So let's break it down between multiplexes and major streets. If you're a developer and you want to build a multiplex, the first thing that you need to do is go to the City of Toronto's official plan, land use schedule, and look at the map of the city and look at all of that yellow that you see across the city and make sure that the property that you want to develop into a multiplex is in that yellow area, because those are neighborhoods. If it's outside of that area, then we're having a much different conversation. Mm-hmm. The second thing, yellow is good for us in this case. Yes.
One of the rare occasions that yellow is good. Okay.
The second thing that you need to do is look at the zoning. Go to the City of Toronto's zoning map and look for that yellow again, because those are the 2 key factors. If you're in a neighborhood in the official plan, and if you're zoned residential, whether it's R, RD, RS, RT, all of the City of Toronto's residential zones, that's where you can build your multiplex. So you can do up to 4 units in that stacking typology in one way or another. So that's what you're looking for. Then you're bringing in your architect or your designer to figure out what does that building look like on the site that you're working with, and what do you need to do in order to fit within those zoning provisions in order to make this an as-of-right development. Oftentimes, it's important to verify with the city before you go in for any sort of building permit application or things of that nature, that your interpretation of the zoning bylaw is correct. So often what we're doing for clients is, okay, they found their site, their multiplex site, they're going to build a fourplex, they've got the architect preparing the renderings and the site plan and the building statistics. They come to us and we liaise with the city to make sure that their interpretation of the zoning is correct. And if there are variances that are required, we have that discussion in terms of whether, these are things that we could justify. Maybe we need some relief on a rear yard setback or a side yard setback due to some site-specific condition. Okay, let's talk about that. Or is there a way that we can adjust the design to make this as straightforward as possible? This is an as-of-right development, and then we go straight to building permit.
And okay, so I want to just go back to exactly your last sentence there. So hypothetically, if I pick my yellows correctly, if I go there and say, okay, this is the right property, this is the right area, we can do this. I'm foregoing zoning, I'm foregoing site plan, and I'm foregoing like community adjustments, minor variances, all that is foregone. And I can basically show up to the city with a permit set in hand. And I think city is obligated to tell me like within a month or two if I can build that building or not, basically, or how I can. Is that a fair way of putting it?
That is the most straightforward path you can take, and that is a fair way of putting it. I would say when it comes to making sure that you are within the zoning parameters for the proposed development, it's hopefully as easy as you meet the setbacks, you meet the height provisions, the landscaped open space, things of that nature. What you do want to make sure of is that there aren't any site-specific zoning exceptions, which are typically different zoning parameters that apply to certain sites across the city that are either there for historical reasons or due to the harmonization of our former several municipalities, or for other reasons that might limit the possibility of that development. For example, the multiplex OPA and ZBA removed the density limit. So FSI doesn't apply to multiplexes across the city. However, if you find yourself in a zone with a site-specific zoning exception that does limit that density, then that's something that you need to take into consideration and should be revealed through a zoning review with the city. So to answer your question, yes. So the way that you've presented it is the straightforward way, and that's what should happen.
The most optimistic and most fortunate way that it could happen, basically.
Exactly. There's still that back and forth and the due diligence that you have to do to make sure that your interpretation is correct.
And just to add to that, it's funny because that's how we've been presenting it, certainly to clients as well. Just with, again, all of the different zoning parameters or provisions that exist to regulate development on any individual site in the city of Toronto, we're definitely finding that most of the ones that have been presented to us, there is still the need for a variance, 2 variances, 3 variances in order to get these things off the ground. What we try to do in order to make sure we can get this done and get this done quickly for multiple reasons is try to work with our clients, as Robbie mentioned, to avoid variances. Because like you said, that's straight to building permit. If we can go into the city, provide those drawings, we get a zoning review formally back that says no variances, you're good to go. Perfect. That's ideal. But we are finding most of the time that whether it's by client choice or whether it's really because it absolutely just doesn't work without the variances, that I could never tell. Right. That's up for debate, but we've been having to do variances more often than not for these things. And it's very important that people out there who are looking to do this understand that a variance isn't acceptable because you're building a multiplex. You can't just show up to the city and say, I'm building a multiplex, so give me this variance. that variance still needs to meet those 4 tests of the Planning Act that we're not going to go into now, but it's going to get analyzed like every other variance. And when you show up at the committee, it's just as open to public comment as anything else. And we've been getting a lot of people showing up at those meetings who are, frankly, mostly speaking about the fact that they don't want a multiplex in their neighborhood and not necessarily always talking to the actual variances that you're actually submitting for. So I just want to caution people out there that just because it's a variance to support a multiplex doesn't mean you're not going to have to review it like a variance to any other built form.
And I guess going back to something that you guys mentioned earlier is that we're at the beginning of the learning curve, probably for all the stakeholders involved, including our neighbors, including the people who live in the neighborhood that, you know what, yeah, we haven't had a multiplex and all of a sudden in mid-block, you want to have a 4-unit building, and what does that mean for the rest of the block? So I understand that. And I want to go back to the point about the variances, and I would be interested to know what your take is on it. We've had in previous discussions, in previous episodes, we've talked about some of the planning decisions and discussions. And one of the things that I know I've seen and witnessed and I've been part of, and I think maybe even you and I have had this discussion at some point, Michael, in the past, that at what point do you say it's enough and you stop and don't keep pushing the envelope in terms of what you're asking, right? In terms of a bigger project, it's a harder decision to make. Do you go for 8 stories? If you're going through the whole exercise, I might as well ask for 10 stories. Or if we get 10, do we go for 20? And I'm sure you guys have seen a ton of that happening over the past number of years. It's probably more prevalent than it should be, just keep asking for more. But on these smaller ones, I don't think the sky is the limit, obviously. There's a clear limit when it comes to the multiplexes, from what I'm gathering. What are some of the things people shouldn't be asking or asking for?
I would say so far in our experience that, like you say, this is a learning curve for all of the stakeholders involved. It's a learning curve for the neighbors. It's also a learning curve for the city staff who are dealing with these policies on their end. I would say that for some variances that perhaps might seem minor in the context of a single family home or a semi-detached dwelling, they, because of that learning curve, might be more conservative about how they apply that to a multi. For example, if you're going and asking for relief for the rear yard setback by, I don't know, let's say 3 meters for a single family home, perhaps the city will treat that as, okay, we can justify that. If it's a multiplex, perhaps the city will say, we're not sure we can justify that. This is a new policy. How will the neighborhood respond? I'm using that as an example, and it's not something that I can speak to concretely, but I would say that the variances have to be justified against the criteria that we as professional planners have to adhere to and justify. I think, like Michael says, you're not going and asking for the moon on these projects. It's what do you need to make this more feasible for the site, perhaps a better living condition for the end user. Drastically changing what the policy is attempting to accomplish is not gonna go anywhere.
And I think too, adding to that, and again, for anybody who's looking to do these multiplexes, the City of Toronto makes information available on previous variances in the neighborhood. It's very easy to get that data from the city. And what that does is give you a really good idea of what kinds of variances have been approved in that area. And if you're seeing the same variance 10, 15 times in the last 5 years, so a front yard setback or the height of the front wall, that's a very good indication. That's something that's permissible. But if the variance you're looking for, you've done that search through the city and you've found a single variance in the last 10 years within a 2-kilometer radius,
don't go for it.
You got to start asking some hard questions. It doesn't mean it's wrong, but you got to start asking some hard questions.
Right. And I think that's mostly common sense. If you're picking up because the way I see it and the way I understand from what you guys are explaining is that city is, which I think is a very smart move, by the way, is saying here's a very clear path of what you can do very quickly. Don't ask for more and you get it done. But if you want to start asking and tweaking and being a little bit needy and like asking for too many things, then we make you go through all the hoops that we make everyone else go through. And that's not the intent or the spirit of this plan. The spirit of this plan is if we have I'm just going to throw out a number. I'm going to say 80,000 lots in City of Toronto or in GTA that will qualify to go through this. Let's get 10% of that going. Let's get those 10% that are ready. And if you're someone who's a developer, new developer in real estate investment, real estate investor, or someone who owns some of these properties, it might not be the right move to go and see, okay, which one can I get more? Which can I get more? Which one could I get faster at this point in time might be a better question asked. And which one's more toward the streamline? Let's go and do it. And with that said, I want to ask you guys, have you actually seen any of these things go through the finish line or certain lines? I haven't. I'm wondering if you guys have.
So I'm not all the way through to construction because it's still very new, but we have had a couple that we've gone through the variance process. And that involves from the start of, okay, the clients purchased the site to they put together initial design. We've looked at it. We've said, we're going to need to nibble around the edges here because it's not working necessarily, into a zoning review, through to identification of variances, through the variance process and into actual approval of the variance. And now it's in for building permits formally. And just that process, start to finish, that I just described, from purchase to variances approved. I've seen one at 7 months that we got done. And I've seen one now that's over a year and still doesn't have the variances done. And so I just want to put that out there so people get an idea of timing, right? If you're going the variance route, like you've explained how quickly it can be done if you go as of right? Building permit, zoning review, permits issued, done. Right? But when you're entering that zoning, that variance process, and Robbie and I talked about this earlier today, and we said, 7 months, that's good. And it is from purchase to approval, 7 months in the GTAs.
It's
with
sad, but it's good.
That's with a variance too.
It's sad, but it's good. It's sad, but it's good. It can be faster, right?
I also have a client that we're working on preparing the plan of condominium for the multiplex, but the multiplex is actually under construction right now. We're getting close. And I think just more generally and philosophically, if you look at the city of Toronto, a lot of the downtown neighborhoods already have quasi-multiplexes. They have homes that have been transformed into multi-unit apartments. Lots of my friends live in them. They make for great places to live. And I think that in terms of bringing the new multiplex product to market, the industry is still catching up and acclimatizing to what that means. But really, we've seen this product already, and lots of us want to live it.
I totally agree with you. And that we have very nice ones from a very decades ago, and we have some recent ones that are also nice and good. Okay, so that gives us something to work with. I'm going to just put this in brackets here, and I don't know if we want to spend too much time on it. I'll leave it up to you guys. But part of me feels that once we get through the learning curve, as part of the whole learning curve discussion, once we get through the first bit of this planning and the zoning and like variance and everything, probably the next step would be to figure out how we make it work with the building code, and also make it work with now Enbridge giving you access for 4 units and Toronto Water not giving you a hard time for bathtubing the basement or something like that, because I actually don't know. That's why I was asking if you guys know if a project has gone through the full cycle, because I have been involved in projects that you go and even it was a renovation project that we were recently involved in. It was a very small project, renovation, and it's still by default, some of the authorities are so used to the condo of 160 units, which they take the same platform and apply it to these smaller ones. And it was a very lengthy process. But anyways, I'll leave that there. So I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to move forward and say, let's just talk about, generally speaking, about the planning, right? And the role of you guys in the process and the Planning Act and all the fun stuff that comes with rules and regulations and guidelines. What are some of the things you see your colleagues, and by colleagues I mean the architects, it could be developers or any other planners, neglect that maybe they shouldn't, maybe there's a hidden opportunity there, and let's go from there.
This is a good question. I think going back to my comment just a couple minutes ago about the industry catching up to what these policies can mean for adding more housing supply to the market. I guess From the planning side, I wish this were going faster. I wish it was happening more quickly. Like I said, we've already seen these types of multiplexes, if you will, in the city for decades, depending on the policy environment that's changed over the years when they were allowed to be built, or if individual homeowners have turned their single-family homes or townhomes into multi-unit apartments. But I think more broadly at other great cities that we think about around the world, even close to home, like Montreal. If you go to Montreal, all of downtown Montreal is this missing middle that we call it here in Toronto, where there's
beautiful city,
multifamily, low-rise apartment buildings, multiplexes that have great layouts, that are family-sized units, that have windows at the front and the rear, or vice versa, I should say. And I think in Toronto, this is my personal opinion, we need to think a little bit bigger about how we can bring those type of really livable units to the market with these new policies that the city has passed, because I think that's the intention. We have in the city a lot of single family homes, a lot of townhomes, a lot of semis that are really affordable to a very small segment of the population at this point.
True.
And then we have a lot of tall towers downtown that are suitable for a very certain life stage. And it's not that you can't live in a tower with a family, but we've built a lot of units for singles, couples,
with
roommates.
Murphy beds and no closets. Yes,
exactly.
Unfortunately, yeah.
But the market is demanding urban living. Like, we want to live close to where we work, close to where the action is, close to where the grocery store is, the coffee shop, and all those things. And this is an opportunity for us to introduce this type of housing that provides so much more access to that lifestyle with really great units that you could actually, have a couple of kids in or downsize into later in life. And I'm excited to see where this goes, but I think that we need to look at some examples from elsewhere and think, how can we do that in Toronto? Because there's lots to draw on elsewhere, and I think we're still getting there.
Amen. Amen. Michael, will you second that?
I'll second that. That was a great answer. Better than what I was going to give.
But I guess going back to what you said, and it's part of the reason that we do what we're doing here, is that whenever we talk with other colleagues and professionals in the industry, it seems like everyone has the same destination in mind, like you just explained. This is not the first time I'm hearing those words, and it's very common, but I don't know, there's a will missing, or there's a platform missing, or maybe we're just moving toward it very slowly, maybe a little bit more slower than we need to get there. So with that said, I want to go and ask Michael or Robert. I don't know if you guys have a crystal ball, but if you had one and you wanted to look forward and say, listen, based on what we're seeing so far, what we're seeing happening, or have seen happen over the past, let's say 2-3 years. And I want to be fair. I want to say in the past, at least 3 years, I can say for sure that some very good stuff has happened. Like the GST, HST discussion on the rentals has helped. The parking requirements in City of Toronto has helped. All these changes that we're talking about as of right, these are very helpful items that are happening. Again, they could be happening faster, but they're very good. What could the future bring? Do you know anything?
I think it's interesting, and I don't know if these are changes in the planning framework, but I think it's very much to what Robbie was speaking about here, which is that we're entering an interesting time where the old model might not necessarily work financially in terms of making these projects go. Certainly we're seeing a bit of a stall right now. And this, from my experience anyways, it's a market field that definitely works on precedent, right? Mm-hmm. What's worked before? Let me go do that. And I think that with all of these interesting initiatives coming at the same time as maybe a bit of a market necessity to innovate and do something different might actually be a bit of a perfect storm to see something new, right? To see something previously in a neighborhood, let's just say. What did a developer try to do? They tried to buy 3 or 4 lots, singles, and turn it into 10 towns. And that's one way to go about intensifying neighborhoods. I'm not even necessarily sure philosophically I have a big problem with that. I probably don't, but certain plans, official plans aren't set up for that. But this is a different way to intensify a neighborhood with a different product that we don't see marketed in the city of Toronto, like Robbie was saying, but we see marketed in Montreal all the time. Is this the perfect storm that kind of pushes people to try that? And if that works, do you get way more buy-in? And when does that snowball start rolling, right? Now might be the time.
Yeah. And I like the way you put it, the perfect storm, because a lot of things are coming together at a certain time, and the combination of all of that might actually be able to break this barrier and create a breakthrough. Because in my humble opinion, my 2 cents is that we will need, and I've said this before on different platforms, is that we will need a lot, and I mean hundreds of smaller developers to be able to do what you just described. Take a single family house and you used to flip it, or you used to tear it down and build a $3 million custom house, which not too many people can afford anymore. And instead of that, tear down something that's falling apart and build four units. Do affordable, reasonable in a mature neighborhood, and you have access to a whole bunch of other things. And why not do hundreds of that in a year? And that alone will help.
Yeah, and it'll help regenerate neighborhoods and continue to see investment in neighborhoods, right? I think that's important piece of this too. When you open up something like this, you open up another avenue for kind of reinvestment in neighborhoods, reinvigoration of neighborhoods, getting new people into neighborhoods. Whereas if you have a very stringent policy framework, in my opinion, you might see stagnation, which we are seeing, by the way. There are many parts of the older city of Toronto, which I drive in it, and it's a waste. It's a great area, great nature, natural resources, proximity to everything, and all of a sudden you drive through one of these streets which has a lot of quote-unquote character, but half the houses are falling apart, and that's a shame.
I would just like to add to this, your question, and I want to take it in a different direction. First, I think we need to celebrate the success that we've had already, because if you think about 2 years ago, these multiplexes were a battle at City Hall.
Yeah.
6 months ago, the major streets were 30 units max, not 60 units max. We're making a lot of progress, and I think that there's time to see how that takes shape in the city of Toronto. If I were looking into my crystal ball, I think that we need to see some of these innovations in other municipalities across Ontario. I think Toronto can be a leader in that, but I also think that those characteristics of urban living that we were talking about before shouldn't be specific to the city of Toronto. We should be able to provide that sort of gentle density, walkable lifestyle that so many people want in places across Ontario. You shouldn't have to live in the biggest city in the country to get that. And I think that's somewhere that we need to go. And if I'm looking in my crystal ball, there's demand for it. And the mid-sized municipalities, Hamilton, Kitchener-Waterloo, Barrie, Kingston, we have lots of single-family homes there. But there's other typologies that we can bring to those markets. And I hope that this is an example.
They're great cities to start absorbing more population. And why not? You have this infrastructure there. You have the universities. You have the industrial complexes that can support more people. And why not? To your point, these are all. And I want to say optimistically, if you look back in history about what we're doing here, many of these municipalities by default have followed Toronto. Right? When something got a play. Maybe they don't even say we're following the Toronto guidelines or the standards, but they are. Like you go to some of these municipalities and see, okay, this is actually very similar to what we do in Toronto. It's not called the same thing, but so I'm totally with you. I'm optimistic, and I'm gonna top it up one more step. On the construction side, I'm seeing a lot of innovations. Going back to what Michael was saying with the necessity that we're feeling right now, is that we're seeing a lot of innovations which are applicable to these smaller typologies of buildings, which we cannot do in a 40-story building. 40-story building, you still do it with concrete. But if you're talking about a 6-story building, which the code is allowing to do mass timber, or you're doing prefabricated panels and floors and a whole bunch of them, I can probably count 24 different systems that you can use. At this very point in time, it all, hopefully, all will come together and create that perfect storm in a good way, which, you know what, you have the necessity, the bylaws, the planning laws are letting you breathe a little bit. At the same time, the construction is not, let's go strict frame it and take a year to frame something 4 stories and be complicated. No, we can put it in the factory, ship it to site, literally could have a building up in 6 weeks, right? Which is more and more becoming a reality. And that's the part that I agree with you. We should celebrate the wins and gets me very excited. Is there anything I should have asked you and that I didn't?
I gave you the two steps to I don't know, what did we call it? The steps that the developer needs to go through for the multiplex. Right. I think I should also say what those are for major streets too, just to round it out. Please do. Okay, so if you're a developer and you want to apply the major streets policies, which are not yet enforced, but will hopefully soon be, you do three things. The first thing is you look at the City of Toronto's Map 3 and its official plan, which shows all of the streets that it calls major streets across the city. If your property's on one of those major streets, that's your first check mark. The second thing is, are you in a neighborhood? So looking on, again, the land use schedule of the City of Toronto official plan, look for those yellow areas. If you're in one of those yellow areas, that's your second check mark. And the third thing is it needs to be zoned residential. So you're looking again at the zoning code, the zoning map, looking for that yellow again. If you've got all three things, those are the major streets areas. Those are where you can apply the major streets policies, and those are the first steps to take.
First steps. And again, if you do that, and if you meet all of that, you're foregoing zoning, you're foregoing site plan. I'm going to go out. No, you're not foregoing site plan?
You're foregoing site plan up to 10 units.
10 units. Okay. Yeah. Above 10 units, you still go through site plans.
Yeah.
You still have a little bit of a bump in the road, but it's less of a bump.
It's what happened is, I'll contextualize it this way. People used to talk about entitlements, still talk about entitlements. When you're on a major street and you're checking the boxes Robbie just talked about, you have entitlement. You can build that 6-story building with those performance standards. You're going through site plan to deal with the nitty gritty, and fingers crossed, that's still going to take time. You're still going to have to spend your money on your consultants, but you have the entitlement. There's no risk there. And that definitely, so it takes away a huge risk profile. And I think it's still quicker to do that than it is to do OP zoning in site plan, much quicker. So like you said, in the vein of celebrating victories, it's a significantly larger portion of the city now that's open up for 6-story development in places that I think, frankly, the planning profession probably, if you asked put truth serum in any planner over the long course, for a long time, would have said, yeah, that's a right spot for a 6-story building in the City of Toronto. But it was never, you didn't have the entitlement to do it. So you had to go fight for that entitlement, and then you could get into the nitty gritty of a site plan detail. And that's
such a big fight to get the entitlement, to your point, that in most cases it was not justified. Numbers wouldn't work for you to go and start that fight and fight for many years to go to 6-story, 60 units, such a small project. That's why on many of any of the projects, people choose to fight on the ones that they can get 20 stories or 30 stories, because that kind of justifies the cost up front. And yeah, I totally agree with you. And I guess if I want to simplify it for myself, what this has done, to your point, it has changed the question of can I do that, to how can I do that? At the end of the day, you can do it. It's just a question of how can you do it and within what variables and design requirements. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. And I think it's also fair to say that the City of Toronto staff, I think, are very aware that this is their first move in this direction. And I fully expect that in the fullness of time, there will be minor tweaks to make the how work better for all parties, right? For neighbors in the area, for developers, both, to make these buildings more successful. I think that there's going to need to be minor changes to make it work perfectly, but I have all the faith in the world that we're going in that direction, and people understand that still needs to be fine-tuned. It's a very new and very interesting tool that's in the box now, but we need to make sure we sharpen it.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I want to keep everyone focused on that learning curve discussion, because to your point, we're at the beginning of a learning curve. There will be a learning curve. We all know that. Unfortunately, there will always be some pioneers that need to go through the whole thing and figure it out for the rest of us to smooth the way. But that's called history, and that's called progress, right? We've always had to do that throughout the human history. Wrapping this up, is there any specific resource, website, book, newsletter that you guys subscribe to or read on a continuous basis to keep yourself updated? If there is, please share it with our audience.
Starting off with resources, the City of Toronto's website when it comes to major streets and multiplexes and just the expanding housing options and neighborhoods project itself is really comprehensive. So there's a lot of information to dig into on there. Go there first if you're thinking about these developments. Other resources, I'm so deep in the urban planning and development Twitter world that I can't name any off the top of my head, but reading all the time. But I think maybe on a high level point around that, there's so much interest and conversation about development, city building, urban planning in Toronto and Ontario more broadly that you can participate in on Twitter, on the other forums. So there's lots of stuff out there. You can always call us too, because we're talking about these things all the time, and we're happy to. As you can tell from this conversation, it doesn't take much.
Shameless plug. Record another 4 hours. What about yourself, Michael? Do you have any suggestions or anything?
The only thing I'd add, and I honestly think it's across certainly our company that we've noticed this, is that the City of Toronto staff working on this are, and again, it's their initiative and they're very interested in seeing it happen. They've been very responsive, very quick to give guidance, or not quick to give guidance, actually probably informed in their guidance. And I think calling the city staff who are responsible for the initiative is a great idea. If you have questions, they've been a great resource to us because again, everybody's reading the words for the first time and trying to figure out what do they mean and what do they mean when you implement them. And so they've been absolutely great in that regard.
That's good to know. And maybe we invite them on the podcast, one of these episodes, and get them to explain their vision to us on this one. That would be great. Thank you very much, gentlemen. This was fun. I learned a lot. I took a whole bunch of notes, and I'm hoping, who knows, maybe in a year we have a repeat of this conversation and we have even more great news to celebrate all together. Thank you very much for your time. And talk to you soon.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It was great.
Just one last thing before you leave. We've created a document called Real Estate Development Toolbox, which you can download for free from our website at realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. This document is basically the result of us asking our network and our listeners, what is a top tool that you use on a daily basis to keep yourself aware of information that's going on in the industry, the changes, the trends, the technologies, the regulations, or if you, with the tools that you use to make sure that you deliver quality results to your clients and customers, the tools that help you with productivity in what you do, and also any softwares, specialized softwares that you think are useful to share with others. So if you think there are resources that you're using on a daily basis and you would like others to know about them, please make sure to let us know, and we will make sure to include it in the next iteration of this toolbox. Thank you very much, and I hope you find this document useful.